Hello and welcome to the Night Owl Philanthropy podcast, What's Your Why? I'm your host, Dean Jones, and in this series I ask charity leaders and change makers to share their why, their purpose, experiences and values that drive their work. Each episode goes beyond job titles and campaigns to uncover the real stories behind social impact leadership, exploring what it takes to stay resilient, purposeful and compassionate in a demanding sector. Today is a special one for me. It's my first international episode, and I'm joined by Madison Wood-Gonzalez, Executive Director of Morning Light in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States. Morning Light runs a 12-bedroom facility providing no-cost housing, compassionate care and dignity to terminally ill people with limited means or who may be in circumstances where they're homeless, serving over 1,000 hospice patients since it opened in 2004. Madison, thank you so much for joining me. Let's start, as we always do on this podcast, with that central question. What's your why? When someone asks you, why end-of-life care for people experiencing homelessness or with limited means, how do you answer that in your own words?
First, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. My why, and I believe the why for our mission, is we believe that everyone deserves compassion, care, and dignity. And it doesn't matter if that's at the beginning of life or at the end. You know, we often hear it takes a village at the beginning of life, but it also takes a village at the end. And the end of life is something that I feel like as human beings, we really need to demystify a little bit and embrace a little more, because it is something that, you know, we will all encounter in some way, shape, or form. And there just aren't enough resources for people. At least in the US, there's just not enough resources and education and opportunity for people. And so we are really about restoring that dignity and valuing the human experience and each human life until the very end.
Thank you. And for listeners who may not know you, how do you introduce yourself and explain what Morning Light actually do?
Absolutely. I'm Madison, and I've been with Morning Light nearly 9 years now. I serve as their executive director. I actually started with the organization. I have a background in special events. So how does somebody, you know, with a hospitality background in special events make their way to working into end of life care? I knew that I really wanted to use my knowledge and my skills to make a difference in my community. I found Morning Light, and I was really taken by the mission, because in the US, you don't often hear about the intersection of, you know, hospice, someone who's terminally ill, and then unhoused, or someone who is experiencing financial hardship or resource limits. And I thought, wow, both of those things in themselves is a heavy thing for someone to take on. But together, it's unbelievable, the predicaments that people can face. And so I started working here, you know, doing special events and things, and the opportunity came up for me to assume the role as executive director. And I've been serving for 5 years now, and it's just been an absolutely life-changing experience for me. I've learned so much about myself. I've learned so much about the community, and I'm just really proud of the impact that we've been able to make.
And what do you think, if there was sort of one element of what Morning Light do that could have kind of drawn you into working with, what would you say is the key element that kind of made you think, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do, this is where I want to stay, this is where I want to make my
I want people who often feel forgotten or overlooked or unimportant to feel seen and respected and valued. I think that our society, our culture can often turn away from death because we think it's scary. It's something unknown. It's not necessarily something that people gravitate towards. And I feel like that can leave a lot of people, even who do have family or do have financial resources, feeling pretty lonely, or abandoned is a strong word, but forgotten. And also when you think about, you know, people who are unhoused or who don't have a safe place to be, that's very lonely and scary, and you can feel very forgotten. And I just don't want anyone to leave this world feeling like they didn't matter.
Thank you for that. Was there a particular person or story or moment when you refer to sort of leaving people alone or isolated in that way that connected you to and cemented your commitment to leading this organization?
That's a great question because
Mm,
like I mentioned, I started, my original title was assistant. I was just working in admin, really.
mm,
And it wasn't until I started going to Morning Light Home because
mm,
the offices were offsite. I remember going into the home and thinking, these people don't have anyone to leave their legacy or their story to.
mhm,
And I remember a conversation that I had with a gentleman. We used to bring someone in, and still do sometimes, but to cut hair.
mhm,
And such a simple, thing that people take for granted, just a
mm,
haircut. But how
mhm,
often, getting your haircut makes you feel human and dignified. And also, I'm sure hairstylists know you kind of become a therapist. It's
mm,
amazing how people open up and start telling you their stories and sharing
mhm,
things when they're getting their hair cut or hair
mm,
done.
mhm,
And so I just really befriended this guy who had
mm,
had come in. His name was Richard, and he was kind of my first real connection. And he had the funniest stories. And he said to me, I used to wake up every day just waiting to die. And here I
mm.
don't do that anymore.
Right.
And he felt like he was part of something again, and he felt like he mattered again. And that was just so important for me to hear. But
Mhm.
Richard also kept journals by his bedside. And he said, when I pass away, Madison, I want you to have my journals. And so
Okay.
I had them in my office. And the very last entry that he wrote was, too many of us leave this world with our stories untold.
Mm,
And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to share these
mm,
stories with people. And once I
mhm,
started doing that, I went to my boss and I'm like, can I take on this storytelling project? I really think people need to learn about the real people here because, 12-bedroom home who provides housing for hospice patients as a concept
mm,
is one thing. But when I tell you we're providing, housing for Richard, who is a
mm,
grandfather who grew up in Indianapolis and who, loves milkshakes and wears funny t-shirts every day and has a great sense of humor. And you start to humanize an individual.
mhm,
It was amazing what that did for our fundraising. It was amazing what that did for our profile in the community. People really started to say, okay, I get this. And they
mm,
can see that death is really just a human being going through something. And so I started telling the stories and that's kind of how I came out of, I guess, my admin shell, so to speak.
mm,
And I started telling the stories and I started getting us some pretty great media attention.
mhm,
And like I said, if for laying that with my special events, I thought, I want to bring celebration to this home. I want
mhm,
to bring celebration of life to this home because you have every day, right? Every day that you're here, you have the opportunity to make a memory or to make someone feel special or to make someone's day a little brighter. And so I'm a eternal optimist and I brought that energy to death and dying. And it's
mhm,
amazing kind of the stories that started to tell themselves once we started
mhm,
doing that. And I just knew I found my place. I just knew I
mm,
wanted to stay and I wanted to continue. I really didn't know much, to be honest, about hospice before I
mhm,
came
mhm,
to Morning Light, but I have also since lost a best friend. I've lost my grandparents.
mhm,
I have now experienced loss myself, and
mm,
I do not think that the experience would have been the same if I hadn't been working here and learning what I've learned and how to support people at the end of life. And I just feel like it's such a important lesson for all of us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing Richard's story. And I think it's something about the fact that Richard's story has now taken itself over the pond to the UK,
Yeah.
and his story has been shared with another audience. And what a wonderful thing that is. And if Richard was still with us, I'm assuming he isn't. I'm sure that he would be amazed to think that his story is still being shared,
He's
and
an
that's a great
international
legacy.
star
An
now.
international star, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. So before taking on leadership, you alluded to your grandparents. Before taking on leadership at Morning Light, what did life look like? Work, family, expectations. How did this change your trajectory from where you were? Where were you? I know you mentioned you're
Sure.
in
It's
events
a
and things
great
like that.
question. I mentioned that
Mm,
I worked in special events. I
mm,
actually had my
mm,
own company. So I went to school for hospitality and then I had two kids. So while I was staying home with them, I was like, I need to do something, I'm getting antsy. And so
mhm,
I started my own event planning company, doing birthday parties for children. And so that was awesome, but it wasn't where I wanted to be forever because I've
mm,
always had this passion of helping other people. I started going to college for social work, and then I changed my major
mm,
to nursing, and then I changed my
mm,
major to hospitality. And it's funny because I feel like those things kind of prepared me for what I do now. It's very much social work. It's very much nursing. I'm neither of those things, but I'm in that
mm,
world now. And so, like I said, I stayed home with my kids, who are now 11 and 9,
mhm.
and and then I found Morning Light, and 9 years later, I'm still here.
That's great. When I'm having these conversations, there's certain trends and themes that I pick up on, and I think sometimes charity leaders are natural explorers. They're kind of on their own little
Yes.
journey, and they're exploring the world. And as you just quite rightly said, there are certain things that didn't make sense at the time, but now they do because they're
Mm-hmm.
part of that kind of exploration into where you've ended up. And the journey's obviously not over, I'm sure. But thank you for sharing that part of your journey so far. I want, if I can ask you to do this, obviously Morning Light existed in a different state or perhaps a similar state prior to you joining. There was obviously a gap that needed
Mm.
filling. Can you sort of articulate what that gap looks like now and whether or not it still exists and how much that gap is filled by what Morning Light does, particularly obviously where you're from in Indianapolis?
Absolutely. So the gap very much exists all over the country.
Hmm.
The gap that needed filling was that people are entitled to a hospice benefit here in the States, but you can't
Hmm.
receive that benefit if you don't have an address. So something
Right.
as simple as an address or somewhere safe for that hospice provider to go that they knew you would be, you would stay put and you would be there for the next visit. And so the original founders was a group of traveling nurses who were getting a
Okay.
lot of referrals, but they didn't have anywhere to see those patients. And
Okay.
so they built Morning Light Home, and that was back in 2004. They worked with a lot of the local hospitals, because a
Hmm.
lot of the hospitals would have patients who came in and got their terminal diagnosis, but they didn't have anywhere safe to discharge them to.
Hmm.
So not only is it kind of meeting the gap for the individual, the patient, but it's
Hmm.
helping the hospitals as well because hospice isn't an inpatient situation or
Hmm.
circumstance.
Hmm.
Hospice is often done in the home or in a,
Hmm.
a hospice home. And so what it's doing is it's freeing up beds in the hospitals as well for
Hmm.
patients who really need to be there,
Hmm.
who, are more critical cases. And so we've partnered with the hospitals ever since. We work with over a dozen different hospice companies and hospitals. Morning Light Home, something that makes us really different is that we are not a facility. So we're not a licensed facility. We are truly a home. So
Right.
we are the address. We provide
Mm.
round the clock
Mm.
caregiving and meals, and we kind of operate as though we would be licensed. But being unlicensed means that we're able to avoid some of those barriers that would keep someone from being in a facility. So it's a
Mm.
very unique model. It's called a social hospice model.
Mhm.
Um, and here in Indianapolis, with our 12 rooms, we are the second largest in the nation next to New York City. So if you
Right.
think per capita, I think we're probably the largest.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not enough. We always have a wait
Mm.
list. I wish we could serve more people, but
Mm.
it's not a moneymaker. Everybody who stays here stays free of charge. So we
Yeah.
don't charge the individuals, we don't charge the insurance companies.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's where philanthropy comes in, of course.
Mm.
But I do wish there were more around the country. I think
Mhm.
every major city needs a home like this because the need
Mm.
is there.
Mhm.
Our population, our generation is aging,
Mhm.
and we continue to see a pressure on where people are going to go and who's going to care for them.
Mm.
I can
So
tell you just one other, quickly, one other gap.
sure.
I know that the latest statistic that I saw is that there's only one paid, trained professional caregiver to every 100 people that need professional care in Indiana
Wow.
right now.
Right.
And so that is a need. And a home like this means that you can care for more individuals, the ratio is there.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're doing individual housing, that's going to be 1-to-1. But here we
Mhm.
have, 1-to-4 or 5. And so
Mhm.
we're trying to meet the need in that way. And I think if this could be replicated, we wouldn't see such a crisis.
So this is a bit of a bleak question, and I say that in advance of asking it for obvious reasons. You're filling a gap, and if that gap weren't filled, and you mentioned there's still a huge need, what
Mm.
is the reality? What happens to particularly people who don't have a place to call their home, and they don't receive the support or the net that you provide or other organisations provide? What's the reality to that situation for so many people?
I think it's
Is it?
important to highlight what hospice actually does. And
Mhm.
maybe it's a little different in the UK, but here in the
Mhm.
States, you're provided with comfort measures. So that looks
Mhm.
like, medications, and you're not getting treatment anymore, but medications and services that are designed to help ease pain of a terminal illness. So
Mhm.
if you're not receiving hospice benefits, you're not receiving that kind of medication or comfort. And for our population, I can give you a couple of examples. We've had someone who was referred to us who was staying in an abandoned garage in the winter,
Mhm.
obviously not receiving services and passing away there. We've had
Mhm.
people under the bridge, we've had people in a tent. We had a gentleman come in the summer. It was, forgive me because I don't know how to convert the Fahrenheit to Celsius, but it was extremely hot. It was,
Mhm.
really, really hot.
Mhm.
And he was staying in a tent in a homeless encampment. He had found a hospice bed somewhere, and he and his sister were living there. But again, he wasn't able to receive the comfort measures and the treatment.
Mhm.
So that's what would happen. They just
Mhm.
wouldn't have a happy ending.
Mhm.
There wouldn't be that comfort. It would be, and I know this is bleak, but it would be painful. It would be
Mhm.
undignified. And so that's the reality if there's not
Mhm.
safety nets like ours.
Well, thank goodness that you exist and that the organisation exists. But there is a reality for you as well in leading that kind of organisation and in
Mm.
that environment with those people going through those things. And I imagine there's a perception from the outside in of what that might be and the
Mm.
question mark of why on earth would you do that? So how, and I don't think that obviously, and I don't think many, hopefully not many people do, but anyway, how would family or friends react when you made the decision to step into that environment and do that sort of work? Was it a positive response? How did people?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think that it expanded their mind. I
Mhm.
think that when I shared the mission, most of the time when I tell people what Morning Light does, the
Mhm.
reaction that I get is I had never thought of that. I had never
Mm.
thought
Mm.
of what would happen to those individuals. And you're
Mm.
right, I do get often people saying like I could never do that.
Mm.
Um I think I would have been one of those people as well if
Yeah.
I hadn't taken kind of the leap. I think on the outside looking in, I would have thought I could never do that because I didn't
Mm.
have experience in it.
Mm.
Um, but no one really does. Death
Yeah.
is one of those things where it's
Mm.
unique to everybody. And I think people would be surprised at how much they would learn and how much it would fill their cup to be able to show support to someone in that state. I think we're
Mhm.
stronger than we think we are.
Mhm.
Um, I did go on to pursue, I'm a trauma-informed positive psychology practitioner now because
Mhm.
I wanted to bring that trauma-informed lens, and I wanted to bring a positive psychology perspective, which isn't just, let's just paint sunshine and rainbows over everything and pretend like things aren't
Mm.
hard. It's
Mhm.
about learning the tools to ground yourself even when you're experiencing hardship.
Mm.
And that mentality is something I try to weave into the culture of Morning Light all the
Mm.
time for our caregivers, for ourselves. It's very much you have to fill your cup if you want to continue to be able to serve, because we're human beings and we have a limited capacity if we aren't taking the measures to take care of ourselves and to feel the things that we need to feel and to debrief afterwards and to reflect on our how things are impacting us. But I think if you learn those tools, you would be surprised at what you're capable of as a leader and as in the face of things that maybe have a pretty negative stigma attached.
You talked about some of those challenges that you faced or had to confront or get through. I mean, how can you give us some examples of what those challenges might have been? So, was it the management of a centre? Was it the management of people? Was it the individuals themselves, or a whole range of different things?
I think that anytime you're working with people, the opportunity for challenge can present itself because people are unique in of themselves. I think we had a case of I'll give you a couple of examples from the different lenses that you mentioned. So from a resident of Morning Light Home lens, we had an individual who was only 28. And he was unhoused up until he found us. He had a really tough life before he found us, lots of trouble at home and substance use and things like that. He wasn't ready to really acknowledge where he was in his illness. And so he would be pretty rebellious. You know, he was pretty rebellious. And we really had to triage, how do you support someone spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally to help them come to terms with where they are? Because what is the other option, you know? And originally he was, like I said, he was kind, but he didn't want to be where he was. And who could really blame him? And so it was a constant, how do we help him express himself through art? How do we give him, how do we invite volunteers in to spend time with him and just to talk or play video games or do things that a 28-year-old might want to do? Because, typically in our home, it's not 28-year-olds, it's 60 and up. And so how do you help somebody feel like they belong? And he was with us for over a year in the end, and he passed away, and he said, my body declined here, but my spirit healed. And that was everything. So I think for a lot of the challenges, if you can focus on someone's spirit and where they are and where they want to be, that's how you navigate those challenges. I think with staff as well, I think sometimes you have to, with caregivers, sometimes they're coming from a pretty difficult background to begin with. And so it's giving them the space that they need to not only process the hardships they're facing at work, which is, getting attached to people and losing them, and just the daily grind of caregiving can be really difficult. And navigating things like dementia and deterioration and just those things, those are not easy. But also recognizing that, we're whole people, and yes, we're at a job, but we also have all of these things going on outside of work. And so Morning Light has built in caregiver support to the mix, because what we were finding is people were burning out. People were leaving. They weren't able to be successful at their jobs because things were too hard as a whole, as a system. So we have a little bit in our budget for caregiver support. So if they need help with transportation, or they need help with housing themselves, or they need help with childcare, just the basics so they can be successful at their job, well, let's do that for them. Because at the end of the day, we're here to serve our community. So let's help the people who are helping us serve the community. We also have a partnership. There's a company here in Indy called Workforce Chaplains. And so there's 24/7 chaplaincy care available for caregivers now.
What does that mean? That's something that's not something we would describe that in that way in the UK.
Sure.
What does that mean?
So chaplaincy is helping to care for the spiritual well-being of someone.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be, it's non-denominational.
Hmm.
But acknowledging that grief can weigh heavy on your spirit, that relationship struggles can weigh heavy on your spirit, that financial trouble can weigh heavy on your spirit. And so it's not therapy, but it's someone who's trained to help care for the emotional and spiritual well-being of people. And so here in the States, when someone is on hospice, they're assigned a chaplain as well. But we thought, okay, what if chaplaincy could extend to our caregivers too?
Right.
And it was amazing. In the first 2 months, we don't get report on, who contacts them or what they contact them about, but we do get a report on how many contacts were made, 90 contacts. So this was
Right.
definitely a need that
Yeah.
our staff needed. And so
Mm.
I think I would urge leaders to think about how you can support your people.
Mm.
Because the more you can support the people, the more capacity they have to support the people that you're serving.
Absolutely.
And I mean, if you want to be kind of nuts and bolts about it, you'll increase your retention, and you'll reduce that turnover, which
Mm.
is expensive and time
Mm.
consuming and
Mhm.
exhausting. And
Mm.
so I find the path of least resistance is the one where you help people. You find
Mm.
how you can support them, and you do that.
Because you're developing a culture within your organization as much as anything else. And if you've got people coming and going all the time, that culture is constantly having to be
Exactly right.
rejuvenated. I mean,
Exactly right.
obviously, there's nothing you can do about the going in the sense of your residents, because that is part and parcel of the nature of
Right.
the service you're providing. But in terms of the provision of care, that you want that to be as consistent and sustained as possible, I guess, for that reason. I think
Exactly. And I would
that's really
imagine
great.
that would extend, to most social service missions.
Mm.
You want that consistency. You want the
Mm.
people who know how to do the thing, and the people that are the beneficiaries of the mission want that
Mm.
consistency. For
Mm.
us, our residents don't want a new caregiver every week. They want the
No.
same faces. They want
Mm.
that relationship.
And that
Um,
chaplaincy, that's something that happens in person, or is it something that they receive virtually, or a bit of a mixture of both?
Mixture. So the
Mm.
chaplains will just do drop-ins here at the
Mhm.
home. So they try to catch people at different times, but
Mhm.
they will meet you off-site for coffee. They will text you. They will
Mm.
FaceTime you. They will, Teams you, whatever it is that you need.
Mm.
And
A
it's
spiritual
24/7.
friend.
So it's
Mm.
amazing.
Mm.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
a really cool program. And so I urge other leaders to look into maybe similar things, because we have our benefits package, right, that we offer
Mm.
our team.
Mhm.
Um, but sometimes it's about ease of access. Like
Mhm.
how easy is it to just pick up the phone and call the chaplain versus, okay, now I have to log into my portal and try to
Mhm.
schedule a meeting and try to go through insurance here in the States
Mhm.
and all of these things.
Mhm.
So it's about making life easier for your team. How can you make life
Mm.
easier for your team? And
Yeah.
I think that's the question that good leaders ask.
Great. Thank you for that. It leads nicely on to my next question, which is about morning light in human terms. And by the sounds of it, your approach is a very human approach. So for someone listening who's never encountered your work, can you paint a picture of a day at morning light, the 12 bedrooms, the home cooked meals, the garden access? At what point would somebody enter that support, so that care? And then what would their journey look like until the point at which, I guess, there's a natural end point to this? What does that journey look like for them,
Sure.
please? Mm.
So everyone's journey is a little different. I know that's not an answer that anyone wants to hear, but it's
Mm.
very true. Death is a very personal thing to each person. Sometimes our referrals come from the hospital. Somebody's gone in with a chest pain or something, and it's
Mm.
deemed that they have a terminal illness and they don't want
Mhm.
to receive treatment for it. At
Mhm.
that point, they need to determine, you know, the hospital needs to determine with that patient, where do they want to go? What's their next step?
Mhm.
The hospital can't keep the individual there indefinitely, so they need to
Mhm.
send them somewhere. But they can't just discharge them to the street because that's inhumane.
Mhm.
So they call morning light. At that point, our social services manager coordinates. They're assigned a hospice team. They come to us typically in a ambulance.
Mhm.
But they get their own room upon arrival. All their toiletries are provided, fresh sheets and linen. Their bed is here. The nurse comes with their medications, their comfort measures.
Mhm.
And then we ask them, what do you like? Who are you? What music do you enjoy? What food do you like to eat? What's your favorite color? We also have a really cool program called the Making Memories program,
Mm.
which is where we ask them, if you could make a memory while you're with us, what would you want that to look like? And like I said, it's very unique to everyone. So is this program. We've had
Mm.
motorcycle bike shows. We've had, fishing trips. We've had Elvis impersonators. We've gone to sporting events. It's very different. What people value is unique to them,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
we want to make
Mm.
that happen. We want to make them feel seen and valued.
Mm.
Typically, our length of stay is about 3 months.
Okay.
We have had people stay a weekend, and we've had
Mhm.
people stay for a year and a half. It really
Mm.
depends on where they are in their illness.
Mhm.
Um, we have volunteers that come in and will read or help cook or just sit with you, do art with
Mm.
you,
Mhm.
sit in the garden with you. And it's really important to us that no one dies alone. So we have vigil
Mm.
sitters that will come in and hold your hand at the end of
Right.
life too.
Mhm.
Does that
And
answer your question?
it does, yeah. Thank you very much for that. And for anyone that hasn't sort of done any research around this prior to listening to this interview, I sort of looked on your social media feeds and seen some of the photographs, and obviously they serve their purpose in terms of storytelling. But something I did notice about the images of some of the patients, and obviously there's a good degree of dignity proofing. You're not just plastering pictures of all of your residents on social media, but the ones that you have put on there, there's a lightness to their facial expressions, which would tell me that the experience they're having is one. You talked about, finding your spirit and things like that, that they seem to be in a place of some degree of contentment, which is,
Mm.
given their circumstances, is a hard thing to achieve. But you obviously do achieve that because it's evidenced in some of the images that I've seen, and what you've described would explain that to a great degree. So thank you for
Thank you
going
for
into
saying
that
that.
explanation. Yeah. So for you, in terms of what your day-to-day experience is like, what are you doing amongst those
Oh boy.
residents and the staff, and
How
what
long
does
do
your
we
day look
have,
like?
Dean? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I am definitely no hero. I have a wonderful team that supports me. I think as a leader, we find ourselves in a funny paradox where we are in the middle, in the pressure point of a lot of different people that we need to make happy. So I have a board of directors that I report to. I have my team, I want to keep them happy and feel fulfilled and appreciated and empowered. And then I have my donors who
Mm,
I want to be happy and
mm,
keep supporting us. We have the PR side of things, so
mm,
getting out in the media and doing things to tell our story. And then, of course, we have the residents. So think what would sum up my day to day, because it does vary, right? I'm involved in operations things. I'm involved in building maintenance decisions. I'm involved in helping to make some high level decisions on certain residents and how we can
mm,
serve them best and their
mm,
cases. I have my fingers in a little bit of everything. Of course, I have the experts along with me in each respective position, which has
mm,
been a big journey, by the way. I
mm,
think the first few years of my leadership was really about finding the right people for the right roles.
mm,
I think until you have that is your primary job as a leader,
mm,
is
mm,
figuring out, okay, what positions do we need? What qualities do we hope for? How do
mm,
we build the right culture into the mix?
mm,
That was a big piece of my role.
mm.
I think maybe it might be deviating a little, so forgive me, but I do want to
No,
mention that after 2020, if everyone remembers what happened in 2020, Morning
yeah.
Light took a pretty big hit, as a lot of other caregiving organizations and health-related organizations did.
Mhm,
Um, it- a lot of people burnt out in 2021,
mhm.
which ironically was also when I assumed executive director role.
Yeah.
So there was
Mm,
a point in time in Morning Light, where it was just myself and one other person on our payroll.
mhm.
So there was just two of us there. Um, and we have now rebuilt to anywhere from 30 to 35 people
Right.
on our team. And so I think each leader has different stages, right, on where you're
Mm,
going to be focusing your efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And so for mine, originally, it was, we have to rebuild. And what was kind of beautiful about the rebuilding was I could really set the tone for the culture that I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And like I mentioned, really bake that kind of self-care and burnout prevention into the cake when we did that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I recognized what 2020 did to my caregivers. I mean, people were really burnt out. And so how do we
Mm-hmm.
protect people in the caring space? Fast forward to now, I I I do a lot of PR work. I do a lot of high-level strategic work, which is really fun for me. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the dreaming and what's next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a while I was a leader who had to be very in the weeds of things while we were still rebuilding and training and doing things. But now I get to be a little more high level and I'm really enjoying that process. And so it's just a lot of asking the strategic questions, answering them, doing strategic planning, guiding the team, and being there to support them as best I can, working with my board of directors, as I mentioned, and
Mm-hmm.
continuing to fight the good fight for morning light.
You touched on, and as so many of my guests have so far in these interviews, that period of the pandemic, which is familiar to all of us. It's a subject that we don't necessarily want to go back to and talk about. One of the themes that comes through in my own personal career as what's sort of representing the intensive care society is around the impact that had on professionals in the
Yes.
sector, caregivers, and this issue of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think you alluded to that a little bit with regards to your staff at the time, and no doubt that they were having these really intense experiences, but you were also having those intense experiences and actually leading through those experiences. Have you found that's had a lasting and detrimental impact on you, or have you kind of used it as a springboard to kind of move into a positive space? How have you carried that with you, and in what form has it taken?
I love that question. I think the pandemic really held up a mirror for a lot of people in the pace that we were running. I think the pandemic burnt a lot of people out. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of us still have residual effects of that burnout if we're not
Mm-hmm.
taking care of ourselves holistically, if we're still pushing through and putting pressure and ignoring our bodies and the
Mm-hmm.
needs that they're telling, our bodies communicate, right? So if we're continuing to skip meals and work overtime and avoid sleeping and we're just not nurturing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We touched on the spirit a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm also big on the body. I think that
Okay.
for me, that period of the pandemic is what helped prompt me to get my trauma-informed positive psychology certification,
Mm-hmm.
because leadership was baked into that certification, and I wanted to set a good example for my staff,
Uh-huh.
um, and not set the example that you have to continue to, like, override what your needs are for the good of
Mm-hmm.
everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
You have to care for yourself. And I know that can be a little bit of a cliche, is like, fill your cup before you fill others.
Mm-hmm.
It might be cliche, but it stands up. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in terms of a detrimental, I imagine some people are still experiencing burnout if we haven't been able to heal or face those things.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of a positive, it opened my eyes a lot to the impacts of what happens when you consistently override your own needs. Eventually, people leave the sector. So if
Mm-hmm.
you want to do this profession sustainably, you don't really have an option but to take care of yourself, or your body will say, no, you either choose to rest or I'm going to choose to rest for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we see a lot of burnout and people just leaving the space. And we need people in this space.
Yeah. You need people in that space because they really need the people that you're supporting really need you and what they're there to
Yes.
experience, what you're there to give them, I guess. And it sounds a bit of a weird way of explaining it. I don't know if it's even the right terminology to use, but you want to give them a good death, don't you? You talked about
A
the
good
fact
death
that
is a great
yeah,
terminology.
yeah, is it? Okay. And you talked about the fact that it's something that we'll all experience, whether we will all experience ourselves and we will always experience it in terms of our families, friends, and
Hmm.
the people that we interact with. How do you ensure, how do you achieve that, sort of in the context of homelessness and deep poverty, for want of a better terminology in terms of describing that? What does that phrase mean to you now, good death? Because it must mean something different now to what it meant
Mm.
before you joined the organization.
I think at the end of the day, we want to leave this world feeling like we mattered.
Mm,
So, what that looks like to each person is unique. To achieve a good death, you want to be asking the right questions of what's
mm,
important to you. Are there
mm,
any things that you're hoping to resolve, any messages you're hoping to give, any things you're
mm,
hoping to say, any things you're hoping to hear? What
mm,
are the things that would make you feel at peace? The ultimate goal is peace and comfort.
mm,
Um, and a good death, it's funny because I feel like death still has this negative terminology. It still has this
mm,
stigma. It's like, oh, death, like it's this
mm,
dark, scary, awful thing.
mm,
Um, and it can be really beautiful because I
mm,
have seen families reconcile. I have seen people hearing the words that they wanted to hear for such a long time, finally at the
mm,
end of their life. I have seen people say things and get things off of their chest that they've been carrying as a burden for such a long time.
mm,
It can be an opportunity to celebrate someone, right?
mm,
Telling stories and
mm,
sharing the good memories. About half
mm.
of our residents have families, about half of
Mm.
them do not.
Right.
And so again, it's just unique to each person.
Mm,
Um, and I think what has been profoundly beautiful to me is that for a lot of our residents, this is maybe the first time in their life that they've really felt like someone cared.
mm,
It's beautifully heartbreaking because you would hope
mm,
that somebody would feel that before.
mm.
Um, but at least they felt it before they left.
Yeah. Yeah. God, there's so many things that I'd like to ask about what you've just said there. I think one of the first things I want to sort of latch on to is with regards to some of the residents or the families saying, I finally had that chance to hear those words or to be able to say this thing. And so I'd imagine from that experience, being exposed to those stories, that you've learned some lessons about life in that process. What would you say those lessons look like?
There's a phrase that says, learn a lot about life through death.
Mhm,
And that could not be more true. Um, I've I've seen it here, at the home quite often. I've
mhm.
also mentioned I've experienced some personal losses.
Yeah. That was with your
I
grandparents,
wish
is
I
that right?
could do my top 5. Yes, my
Mm,
grandparents,
mm.
and my college roommate, passed away from
Okay.
leukemia, and
Right.
that one really hurt. I think I've learned a lot of different lessons. I've learned
Mm,
not to wait,
mm,
and I know that people say that a lot, but we can get so caught up in the little day-to-day tasks,
mm,
and before you know it, years have gone by. And if you have these trips you wanna take or these memories you wanna make or
mm,
these things that you want to do or this impact that you want to have. You've talked about your passion projects and things. Like, don't wait
mm,
to do it. You have to
mm,
find the right time to do it. You don't want to put
mhm,
this like crazy pressure, like I must do everything and again, burn yourself out in a different
mm,
way.
mhm,
But make the plan to do it, make the step
mm,
to do it. Don't wait to tell people the things that you want them to know because you
mhm,
might not get the chance to tell them.
mhm.
Um, be be overly forthcoming with the positive things that you love about people. There's
That's
this
a nice one. I
concept
like
of
that.
a living
Mhm,
funeral, and I think it's
mhm,
so interesting that often we wait to give flowers to someone until once they've passed away.
mm,
Give them
mhm,
the flowers while they're still here. Why do we
mhm,
wait to say these sentimental, beautiful things about people when
mhm,
they can't hear them?
mhm,
So don't wait on that. And perspective about things. We can get very stressed about all kinds of little things that really won't even matter in 5 days, let alone
mhm,
5 years. And so I think something that Morning Light does for me quite often is give me
mm,
perspective. Is the
yeah.
thing that I am so concerned about today or so offended by today or so, whatever, fill in the blank. How does that measure up? Well, does that really is that really something I need to be giving my life energy to? Or
Mm,
is there something else I should be focusing on?
mm.
Um, because a lot of the time, the things that we are so focused on really won't even matter in a week's time,
No,
you know?
absolutely.
And so perspective, making sure that your priorities are in order.
That's some great lessons. Thank you. There was a question I wanted to ask because when you're confronted so often with what we sometimes considered to be difficult, challenging circumstances, end of life being one. Some people talk about becoming immune to the emotions of it.
Mm.
And sometimes that can sound or feel like something quite cold, or we shut off our emotions from things. Do you feel in your role that you have to shut off your emotions, or do you embrace your emotions and turn them into what happens to you? What's happened to you? Because obviously, say for example, if you're in the army, or if you're in the police force, or in the medical sector, you're constantly confronted by some negative, sometimes challenging
Hmm.
circumstances, and you hear people talking about, "Oh, I just shut off for it. I've got the guards are up, and I walk through any situation, nothing can touch me." But how do you embrace these situations?
So compassion fatigue is definitely a real thing.
Hmm.
And again, I'll revert back to my training. You can't shut off emotions.
Hmm.
Emotions are there regardless of if you're going to acknowledge them or not.
Hmm.
What we're really talking about is acknowledging the emotion. And I would urge people to do that. Now, you might need to give yourself space after the fact to do it and debrief. But
Hmm.
if the emotion is there, you either experience it or you store it.
Hmm.
And storing it shows up as, tight shoulders or a locked jaw or a racing
Hmm.
heart rate, or suddenly, you have no more energy because you've just been full of cortisol and adrenaline for such a long time that your body is bottoming out and you
Hmm.
just need to stay in bed for a week.
Hmm.
Emotions have a real impact.
Hmm.
What I would say is give yourself a grounded space to experience them.
Okay.
So, what that looks like is maybe you need to journal about it. Maybe you need to go run it off while
Hmm.
you're thinking
Hmm.
about it. Maybe you need to just take a walk right after it happens and take, some deep breaths. And I know these are the basics, but so often we forget to just go back to the basics.
Hmm.
We want like some 10-step routine or some miracle thing. And it's like, no, our body knows what to do. Our body
Hmm.
knows how to process the things. We knew how
Hmm.
to do it as kids, right? We knew how to cry or run or play or scream or like thrash around or whatever.
Hmm.
That's getting that energy out. So as long as you
Hmm.
are still able to expel the negative energy or the things that would otherwise be stored up and then turn into chronic issues,
Hmm.
um, you can face anything.
Hmm.
I would also say that it's really important if you work in this space to limit the additional stress that you are consuming. The
Hmm.
news, the social media, like all of
Hmm.
these things are constantly also inundating our systems with all of this stuff that we need to be upset about.
Hmm.
And I think that setting time limits for those kinds of things and making sure
Hmm.
that you are also spending a lot of time on things that fill you, bring you joy or peace or happiness or laughter or play or
Hmm.
whatever that
Hmm.
looks like, offsetting that just helps round out the human experience. We can't just
Hmm.
gravitate toward all of the negative things and expect to be okay. I do think shutting it off is something that I used to do, and I think I paid for it physically, so I speak from experience.
Hmm.
Now I just tell myself I'm going to come back to this emotion in a little bit.
Hmm. That's
I'm
a
not
nice
going to
way of
break
doing it.
down and cry or yell
Hmm.
or start sprinting in the middle of the morning light home, right? I will say to myself, like, "Ooh, this is kind of a lot. I
Hmm.
promise you I will come back to this.
Hmm.
Promise myself I will come back to this.
Hmm.
And I will when there's like appropriate space to do that."
Oh, such a rich answer. Thank you very much for that. I want to talk to you about hope and grief and faith.
Mm.
Um, you're working with a group of people that may have lost all sense of hope for one reason or another. In terms of grief, there may not be people that are actually necessarily grieving for them because they don't have
Mm.
anybody. And that's an interesting thing to know about yourself. And also, when you don't have anybody else to lean on, then sometimes, and maybe all the time, faith is something that can be one thing that's always there. So there's that perspective from the resident's perspective, but there's also your perspective on that as well. So I want to ask you about hope and grief and faith, and how that fits into your role and the things that you do and see on a day-to-day basis. And you can, it sounds like a very general, open question, but that just gives you the opportunity to answer in whatever way is comfortable to you, really.
Sure. I think I am amazed by how much hope people can hold on to. I am amazed at how many of our residents say things like, I can't complain, or everything's great, or,
Mm.
you know, the resilience factor is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
There are also a lot of residents who are dealing with some very difficult emotions. Death in itself brings up a whole spectrum of emotions for humans. There's, like you said, there's the loneliness, there's the grief, there's the fear. And so I think grief is also something that we seek to avoid at all costs, but it is just a normal human experience. Grieving is very hard. It's a whole beast in of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But something that comes up quite often for people at the end of their life is that fear of being forgotten. I think I've mentioned that a few times, and that's often the greatest fear. So at Morning Light, what we do is we have an annual legacy event, and everybody who comes to our home also gets their name inscribed on a brick, and
Right.
we tell them, we will remember you. And I think that offers a lot of comfort for people because, quite frankly, you're right. A lot of our residents don't have anyone to remember them or grieve for them, don't have a headstone, at the end of their life. So to know that their name will be somewhere and that someone will read that name and honor them is comfort. So I would encourage people, leaders, even if you're not in the death space, how can you help people feel like they're acknowledged and that they won't be forgotten and show appreciation for them? As for faith, again, I mean, faith is very integral for at the end of life. Here in the States, your hospice benefit includes that chaplain, which is that
Yeah.
spiritual component. We have a lot of individuals who pray and read the Bible. We've had lots of individuals from all different backgrounds and, maybe more pagan faith, but still connected to nature and spirituality and those kinds of ways of connecting with faith. I think everyone has a faith in some respect. They have faith in something. And I think at the end of life, it's very much face to face with that. But going back to the basics, again, just interacting with your faith and your spirituality by feeding the birds outside or, taking a moment to feel the sun on your face or having that conversation about your spirituality and what you believe and processing that, it's definitely important at the end of life.
Right. Thank you. Going to move on now into partnership and leadership. What has it been like to lead Morning Light as an executive director and carrying forward that legacy from since 2004? How do you balance being both sort of the public face of the organization and the person making those, as you've described what your day-to-day looks like, the person making those day-to-day operation decisions? Has it come easy to you, or has it been a series of one challenge after the next?
I think we all have our strengths. And I think that the more you can play to your strengths, the easier your life will be as a leader. I think sometimes we try to examine who we are as a leader and then focus in on those weaknesses, must get better on those weaknesses. Whereas if you focus on the strengths and then hire a team that helps support those weaknesses, that's really how you're going to maximize your impact. And so I'm someone who loves to talk. You've probably picked that up. So I
Talk well.
love, thank you. I love championing our mission. I love the opportunity to share it and get on stages and speak. And so that is something that comes really naturally to me. The thing that didn't come as naturally was some of those more nuts and bolts operational decisions. I can think strategy, but I'll be honest, some of the nuts and bolts things just doesn't come as naturally to me.
Okay.
And so I had to find the members of my team that it comes very naturally for and that they enjoy doing that. So I think life has gotten easier since I have leaned more into, okay, I don't have to be perfect and good at everything. I have to be
Hmm.
good at what I'm good at and what I enjoy doing, and then help find people who are passionate about the things that aren't necessarily my first choice in the day to
Filling
day.
your gaps almost.
And
Yeah.
yes, my
Yeah. Yeah.
gaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just think that that has been a really empowering way to lead for me.
Mm,
But it's been a lesson. Like I said, I
mm,
kind of rebuilt. And so there will be times as a leader that you do have to do those things that you don't want to do.
mm, mm,
um, but I at that time leaned really heavy on my network and mentors and
mm,
reaching out. If I don't know something, I'm
mm,
not going to pretend like I know it. I'm going to go and ask the question and find
mhm.
somebody who does. And I think what's cool about the charity sector is that people genuinely do want to help,
Yeah.
And so that is something that I have found really fruitful is
Mm.
leaning on community experts and mentors and my team.
It's a very humble approach to it as well. And I think you mentioned that it was a very empowering way to lead. And I think it's also a very empowering way to be led,
Mm,
interestingly. So people on the receiving end of that leadership will also feel empowered in that process as well, because they'll feel valued and like they've got some purpose to serve within the organization.
absolutely.
So I think that's absolutely certainly from my experience, is the right way to lead and to be led. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Um, how do you make decisions on big questions like things like, for example, growth or
Mm,
taking risk? Because I guess you could have an attitude that we've got what we've got and that's what I'm here to manage and that's the way things are going to remain until the end of time. Or you could be thinking, oh, actually, should we be more aspirational? Are there things that we could do more of? Are there more people that we can support? Is there something you want to say around that?
I do want to say, I think when I was early in my leadership, I was like, oh, I want to change all the things. I want to, expand all the things. And that energy is awesome and exciting. It's also a little bit
Mm,
naive because changing too much at once just creates chaos. And so
mm,
I learned that the hard way a little bit, but
mhm,
change is good, I think. And
mhm,
again, I kind of go back to when I'm making the decisions, I am bringing in people that I really respect and value their opinions,
mhm,
um, and who might be experts, so to speak, in that section of a decision. And that's where, your board of directors can come in, and that's where your leadership team can come in as well. To I try to make very human-based decisions.
mhm,
That's just my leadership style. So how would
mm,
this impact my team? How would this help more people in the community? How do I do this in a measured way that wouldn't, rob Peter to pay Paul, like help someone
mm,
over here, but hurt someone over here? And so looking at it through that lens. And then you also have to look through the sustainability lens. So
mm,
again, scaling as a nonprofit doesn't always necessarily mean more revenue or income.
mhm,
Now, sometimes it does, but for Morning Light, we've really had to fine tune our model as to how we remain sustainable
mhm,
because, fundraising gets you so far, but you do need some
mm,
community buy-in as well. I'm
mm,
happy to say that I think we've got that model. And so now that we have that model, now's the
mhm,
appropriate time to go, okay, is this expandable? Would we like
mm,
to take that on? What would that mean for scaling your staff, scaling the expenses, scaling the
mhm,
impact? Who might support us in this? Are there any community partners who would like to get involved with this? So there's the dream, and then there's breaking it down to the questions as to how will this impact the organization. And that's how
mm,
I think you make a decision. But risk is good. I'm not opposed to risk, but
mm,
just make sure that you're making a risk that's been calculated.
mm,
Don't just take a risk and hope for the best. Take a risk and
mm,
say, I think this is going to work. It might not
mm,
work, but I think it's
mm,
going to work based on this information that
mm,
I've reviewed and based on what, the people around me are
mhm.
hoping for.
I liked
So,
what you sort of brought into that conversation about sort of the unintended consequences of potentially a positive initial step that could
yeah,
lead further down the line to other people, the rob Peter to pay Paul,
you
it's a
have to
classic.
make sure that your team's on board or it
Yeah.
probably isn't going to go very well.
Mm,
So,
yeah, exactly.
talking to your key stakeholders is really kind of where I start.
Thank you. I want to talk about homelessness now more generally, or people without a home. And I want you to think of that in the context of Indianapolis, but I think also your attitudes towards homelessness globally. And I've traveled a fair amount, and there are certain occasions where I found myself in a context where it seems like my brain switches into, oh, it's acceptable for homelessness here because, it's everywhere. It's never acceptable. But there's something that happens to your brain, your mind around this whole subject, depending on where you are in the context you're thinking about it. What would you say your thoughts are on homelessness generally to begin with? And then I think from there, what would you want more people to understand better about homelessness, perhaps more where you're from in Indianapolis?
I think homelessness is a byproduct of a system that just isn't set up for everyone. I think
Mm-hmm.
that homelessness is a symptom of a failure somewhere in the system. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we can, as a society, continue to have discussions about what led someone to experience this. Because
Mm-hmm.
it's not always a choice. Sometimes it's a choice, but sometimes it's not a choice. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that the thing that I would really want people to understand is that we are all just a couple of misfortunate events from being homeless ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen people come to Morning Light who were very respected, members of the community and got sick. And then
Mm-hmm.
once you're sick, you can only stay at your job for so long until then you're unemployed. And if you're unemployed, maybe you now don't have your housing anymore and
Mm-hmm.
you're not well enough to go out and get a job and get better. And there's
Mm-hmm.
not the safety nets. And I've also seen where, you have caregivers who have spent all their resources caring for their loved one who had a terminal illness or a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And then now that they're gone, there's no one to care for them, but they're sick and now they can't work or they didn't have a job because they were caring for their loved one. There are so many factors
Mm-hmm.
that are at play. It is not just people who have made bad decisions
Mm-hmm.
and now they're homeless. So that's, what they deserve. Like, what a horrible way to think about a fellow human being. I'm sorry. I'm a little passionate about this if you can't tell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and sometimes there are bad decisions that are made, but I think then you have to wind the tape back and ask, where could we have better served these people earlier in their life? What lessons could we have taught them in school systems?
Mm-hmm.
Were we paying attention to what their home life looked like? I think that it's not a solution to homelessness, because if I had a solution to homelessness, I would,
Mm-hmm.
but we need each other. We are human beings that need each other. And I think in the States in particular, and I can't necessarily speak to other countries, we
Sure.
have a very individualistic mindset. Everybody lives on their own. Everybody must earn their own income. They live on their own. I mean, we're all spread apart. So there's this like car culture, right? Where we're just in our cars and then we pull into the garage and then we shut the garage and we never see each other. And we might bump into someone at the grocery store. But aside from that, we are set up as a very individualistic society. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that if we embraced being more of a community, even with multi-generational living more for our elderly population and our younger population, if we had more opportunities for connection, then we could help each other more and support each other more before it got to the point where you're out of resources. There's a shame kind of attached to it, a stigma attached to it, that if you can't provide for yourself, then
Mm-hmm.
you have failed. And I think all of us at one point or another, unless we are just blessed by all the gods, have needed help and support. All
Mm-hmm.
of us have been in a predicament at one point or another where we've needed some help. And I just
Mm-hmm.
encourage people to ask for that help and to offer that help, because there is no shame if you're sick. There is no shame if circumstances are such that you're doing the best that you can, but at this given moment, you're just not able to support yourself or your family.
Mm-hmm.
Let people help you.
Wow, thank you for that answer. I really appreciate that. I think the example that you gave of the caregiver that uses all of their resources to the point that they have none left, and then they find themselves in a position where they
Mhm.
themselves don't get the care that they've been giving. That's so unjust, isn't it? And there's no fairness in that.
No.
And I think that's what it comes down to, really, isn't it? It's about giving everybody that fairness in their lives throughout their lives, not just towards the end. It's such a shame that we're even, having to isolate it into just providing at the end of
Right.
life.
I
It's
can
really,
speak
yeah,
to
yeah,
homelessness through the lens that I can speak to.
of
I wish I
course,
could speak on
absolutely,
the
yeah,
broadest,
yeah,
terms,
yeah,
but it's very rare that someone comes to us simply because they made a bad decision. You know,
yeah, yeah,
that's not
yeah. And
often.
that's really interesting, that stereotype or that preconceived idea about
Yes.
what the people that you're supporting may have come from. I mean, how do things like sort of trauma or addiction, mental health, family breakdown, how do they show up in the stories of the residents that reach you at Morning Light? Is it a common thread, a common theme? I'm assuming it does kind of
Yes,
appear in the
yes,
stories.
yes. Like I mentioned, I think a lot of people come to us and this is their first time in their life. And I don't think I've had people say this to me, that this is
Mm-hmm,
the first time in their life that they feel like people were rooting for them,
mm-hmm,
on their side,
mm-hmm,
advocating for them, cared. And so if you just dial that back to their lifetime,
mm-hmm,
yes, trauma is a theme.
mm-hmm,
Addiction can be a theme,
mm-hmm,
although we don't accept anyone who is active in that
right.
addiction because we're not
Mm-hmm,
set up to support that. So that kind of tells you that, again, addiction's not really the factor here for us. We've had people who have made some poor choices or done things that they regret. But I think, again, you'd be hard pressed to find people who have never had a relationship issue or a
yeah.
decision that they regret.
Mm-hmm,
Yes, family dynamics can be really interesting. We have some
mm-hmm,
families that are visiting every day, and there's 20 of them that come in to see someone. And
mm-hmm,
then you have your individuals who are estranged from all of their family for one reason or another. And
mm-hmm,
um, again, that's kind of unique to them. So
mm-hmm.
having served over 1,000 people, we've seen 1,000 unique stories.
Course, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think in terms of the support that you provide in Indianapolis and in the United States, are you aware of any differences culturally between what you're?
Mm.
I mean, how do people in that sort of situation find themselves thinking about the state and the country in terms of how they're viewed by the US? And I might be able to answer that question from my perspective as a resident of the UK. Do you think there is
Yeah.
an attitude that people pick up on about how they're perceived as somebody who's in need, the sort of people that you might
Hmm.
provide care to?
That's
Do they
interesting.
feel loved?
Yeah, I think that people are more afraid of the fact that the US system isn't really set up to support people who don't have much when it comes to healthcare.
Hmm.
Healthcare continues to be a struggle. And so
Hmm.
I'm not so sure about a stigma in terms of being in need. I don't experience our residents as prideful, so to speak.
Okay.
I think that they're more grateful, if
Hmm.
anything.
Hmm.
Um, but some don't want to be a burden.
Hmm.
People just don't want to be a burden. They don't want to
Hmm.
feel like a burden. They don't want to be perceived as a burden. I think
Hmm.
their struggle comes a little bit more from losing their abilities physically over
Hmm.
time than anything.
Yeah.
Um, they want to be able to give back. They want to
Hmm.
be able to help, in the kitchen or in the garden or these different things, and they're not able. And so that's a challenge.
Hmm.
But I don't often hear any statements made, and this is my own personal experience. I don't often hear
Hmm.
any statements made, about their financial
Hmm.
burden, if you will.
Sure.
I know that
Yeah.
they were stressed before they came to us. I know that they were like,
Mm,
I have no idea what I'm going to do or where I'm going
mm,
to go. But once they've come to us, I think it's just relief.
yeah, of course. Yeah, rightly so by the sounds of it as well. If you could change one thing in the wider system tomorrow, whether that's sort of
Mm.
policy, funding, healthcare, or public attitudes, big question. What would you choose
Oh
and
my
why?
goodness. I wish that there was more funding in the death space because, again, I think it's something that people don't want to look at, so we don't look at it. but just because we don't look at it doesn't mean it isn't there. So I do wish that there was more funding available for people who are in, obviously, the predicament that we're in. I wish that it's a very unique policy, but here, when you're on benefits, you have to apply, through the state to get that benefit. That then means you get hospice and you get housing. But the waiting list is so long to get that benefit right now that most people pass away before they ever get the benefit. And so I wish there was a way to prioritize that a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think throughout this interview, I've got a really good sense about what it is that you provide, and how that feels on the receiving end of that care, and why you provide it and the extent to what you provide. How do you talk about this? Say, people talk about this, elevator situation where you've got to try and get across everything you need to get across in a very short space of time. There are obviously scenarios when you're going to have to do that. Somebody needs to know about your cause so that they will turn into a supporter. It could be a philanthropist, but it could be somebody that isn't really switched on to the cause at all, but through conversation, they're, ignited into action. What sort of things crystallize what Homelight does so you can get that support?
So I guess I could give you our elevator pitch. So we take social media very seriously. So my elevator pitch is more, Morning Light is reimagining end-of-life care. We operate a 12-bedroom home at no cost for individuals at the end of their life. Please follow us on Facebook. And then they take out their phone and follow us on Facebook, because then once we've got you there, we can show you, here's this individual. Here's this cool thing that we're doing. Here's what this looks like. We're inviting you in and we're telling our story, and you can see, it's not so dark and scary. You mentioned a lightness to the photos. There's a lot of joy there. Look at all these people that are involved in this. Like, this is something I want to be a part of. So that's my kind of like tip, I think, is really the call to action isn't like, hey, do you want to support us in that first sentence? It's more like, okay, I would love it if you would just follow along with what we're doing. Sign up for our newsletter, and then we can tell our story over time. The
Sort
other
of
thing that
nurturing that relationship a bit, isn't it?
Yeah. You're kind of bringing someone alongside you instead of trying to like tell them in that moment. And the other thing that I often do is invite people in for tours, because I'm like, you won't believe it when you see it. When you come here, this home is filled with so much light and such a positive energy. And honestly, I mean, I'm not just saying this. Every time I give a tour, somebody comes in and they're like, wow, the energy in this place is awesome. And it is. And I tell them, 1,000 souls have passed on here. Like, we are in sacred spaces right now.
It's a lovely way of portraying it. Thank you.
There is a beautiful energy to the home. And so if I can get people on site to see it for themselves, I've never had someone not want to support in some way, shape, or form.
Great. When you think about sort of legacy for Morning Light and the home generally, what matters most to you personally? Is it the lives that you've served? Is it the model that you've sustained? Is it the policy that you've influenced? Or is it something else, or possibly all of those things?
I think if I'm talking about my legacy for Morning Light, I want to be remembered for the life that we've brought into this home. We tell people, you don't come here to die, you come here to live. And that is something that I would hope is always carried on and always expanded upon if we do get to grow, if we do get to help more people. I want to be remembered for all the work that we've done now, the lives that we've impacted. But I want to be remembered for the fact that I want to feel like everyone I encountered, whether that be staff, volunteers, residents, board members, donors, I want to feel like everyone that I interacted with left feeling valued and left feeling lighter.
Well, that's a great aspiration to have in terms of your legacy. And obviously, if someone was listening right now and they're moved by what you've described, but feel sort of overwhelmed by the scale of homelessness, what's one small concrete thing you'd encourage them to do where they are to contribute in one way? And that could obviously be making a contribution to the
Well, you could
organisation.
always donate to Morning Light.
Yes,
But I
exactly.
would say, I'm just kidding. I would say look in your own town, see if there is something
Yeah.
like Morning Light, some
Mm.
kind of social model hospice, get involved with hospice. If it's homelessness, socks and toothbrushes are always
Mm.
needed. I've
Mm.
packed up wagons with my kids with, just the basics and just gone downtown and delivered things. That's something concrete that you can do. And look them in the eye. Next
Mm.
time you pass someone, just look them in the eye. They're human too. Say hello, buy them a meal. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. We've reached the sort of end of the formal part of this interview, and time definitely has flown by. Your answers have been outstanding and really given a great sense about the work that you do. But we're now going to move into a quick fire round, which is just a bit of light at the end of,
Okay.
a subject which we have to admit is quite heavy, but you've made it light as well in the same token. But first question
Okay.
is a tea or coffee, and how do you take it?
So I'm actually allergic to coffee.
Okay.
So I don't know what I did to curse myself with that because I used to love coffee and then I developed an
Okay.
allergy. So I
Right.
take my tea. I just love mint tea. And
Mint
I know
tea.
in the UK we're supposed to do like the milk and the sugar and the cream and the things, but I just like
Yeah.
mint and
Mint
lemon.
tea. No, that sounds great to me. And are you an early bird or a night owl?
Is neither an option? No, I'm kidding.
Neither is absolutely an option. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I'm more of a night owl.
A night owl.
I'm
Yeah.
not the best in the mornings. No.
After a long week of emotionally heavy work, what helps you properly switch off and recharge? It sounds to me like you're very much in tune with that side of things. But what do you do? Because it's good to get that advice for other people that are listening.
Meditation is big for me. I love
Hmm.
meditating. I love a good sauna session, just kind of
Hmm.
like that physical detox.
Mm.
I love to read.
Mm.
And I love to play with my kids.
Right. And what's one thing about you that might surprise people who only know you from the work that you're doing at Morning Lights?
Oh, gosh. I was in a touring choir.
Wow.
So I've gotten to travel all over the U.S. singing. I've performed at Carnegie Hall in New York City,
Wow.
and that's not really a side of myself that, to be honest, that I embrace much anymore,
No.
other than singing in the car or the shower.
Okay. Have you? I don't suppose it's the right environment to introduce into the home, although maybe it is. Maybe it's something that can be introduced into the home through staff or even the residents.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to do a karaoke night.
Yeah. Madison, thank you so much for a thoughtful and grounded conversation and for bringing us into the realities of Morning Light Home. You've given a powerful sense of what it means to offer a warm bed, home-cooked meals and companionship to over 1,000 terminally ill people with nowhere else to go, and what it takes to lead that work with compassion through the years. You've also been very open about the emotional weight, the systems challenges across the US and UK, and the hope that keeps you and your team going, holding together the needs of residents, staff well-being and partnerships with dozens of hospices. To everyone listening, I hope this first international episode has prompted you to think differently about homelessness, end-of-life care, and what it means to build something grounded in dignity and community. And if you found this conversation useful, please like, follow and subscribe to the Night Owl Philanthropy podcast, What's Your Why, on your usual platform, and share it with someone who cares about social change, charity leadership and supporting the most marginalised. Next time we stay with the theme of purpose-driven leadership and mental health, as I'm joined by Ian Nutt, Director of Fundraising Engagement at Heart of England Forest and Trustee of Oxford People's Theatre. Ian's career has taken him from mental health at Oxfordshire Mind through food, farming and the environment with the Soil Association to leading fundraising for one of the UK's most ambitious woodlands projects. Until then, take care and thank you again, Madison.
Thank you.